Dear students, having discussed classical theory of employment and output determination, and also classical theory of price level determination, we now consider the policy implications of classical equilibrium model. That is, we discuss the effect of fiscal and monetary policy. We study the effect of fiscal and monetary policy on output, employment, price level, output, employment, price level, and interest rate. That is the effect of government action on equilibrium level of output, employment, price level, and interest rate. First, we consider the effect of fiscal policy on output, employment, price level, and interest rate. Now, as it is known to you, fiscal policy is setting of budget, and it consists of decisions of government with regard to spending and taxation. So fiscal policy is related to government budgets, and it is concerned with the decision of the government regarding public expenditure and taxation. Now, we start with government spending. In this session, we will study the effect of the fiscal policy, namely government spending on equilibrium level of output, employment, price level, and interest rate. Now, we first consider the effect of an increase in government spending. We first consider the effect of an increase in government spending. Now, the question of how this increase in government spending is financed arises first. So, the first question we have to address is how this increased government spending is financed. Just like households and business firms, government has a budget constraint. So, the type of fiscal policy that we consider is an increase in government spending. The first question we consider is how this increased government spending is financed. As it is known to us, just like business houses and households, government has a budget constraint. Now, government has three sources of finance. One is taxation. Government can finance increased government spending by taxation. The second is government can sell bonds to the public. Government can sell bonds to the public. A third one is government can create new money by printing currency. So these are the three methods by which government meets increased spending by means of increase in taxation, selling bonds to the public, printing new currency. An increase in taxation, selling additional bonds to the public, and an increase printing of new currency means an increase in the supply of money. And remember this, if we consider the third method, there is an increase in money supply. That is akin to a monetary policy change. As we are discussing fiscal policy, we will not introduce a monetary policy change for the time being. So we assume that money supply is fixed. That means increased spending is not financed by printing new currency, increasing the money supply. We also assume that tax is fixed. Increased spending is not compensated by increase in taxation. So, increase in government expenditure is financed by selling bonds to the public. We assume that increase in government spending, government expenditure is financed by selling bonds to the public. Now, as we will see from our analysis, a bond financed increase in government spending will have no effect on equilibrium values of output or price level. As we will see in our analysis, that is what we are going to see. If increased government spending is bond financed, it will not affect equilibrium values of output or price level. It will not affect equilibrium values of output or price level. Price level is not affected because money supply is not affected. And as we have seen in the previous class, an increase in price level is associated with an increase in the supply of money that we have discussed in the context of quantity theory. So, a bond financed increase in government expenditure will not affect output of price level. This is because we constructed aggregate supply and aggregate demand schedules. We constructed aggregate supply and aggregate demand schedules which together determine equilibrium level of output and price, without reference to government spending. So, we developed a model explaining equilibrium level of output and price level using aggregate supply and aggregate demand without a reference to government spending. Stated differently, output is not affected by government spending. And as long as output is not affected by government spending, employment is also not affected. We can say that employment is also not affected. Now, in order to see why government spending, which is financed by selling bonds to the public, will not affect equilibrium values of output employment or price level. To understand why these quantities are not affected, we have to examine how an increase in government spending affects the rate of interest. How an increase in government spending affects interest rates. Now, let us see this in the form of a graph. Interest rate, S and I here. So, as we have discussed in the previous class, classical theory of interest rate determination is nothing but the loanable fund theory, where interest rate is determined by the twin forces of productivity and thrift, supply of savings and demand for investment. Both the supply of savings and the demand for investment are influenced by interest rates. And in the loanable funds market, an increase in government spending financed by selling bonds to the public can be represented as a shift in the investment demand schedule. Let us see. This is the saving function S, supply of savings. Now, the demand for investment I negatively related to the rate of interest known to us. Suppose that G is greater than T. G means government expenditure, T is taxes, and if G is greater than T, G minus T is positive. If G is greater than T and G minus T is positive, and it is what is known as the government or the budget deficit, G exceeding T is the deficit. Now we assume that before the increase in government spending, G was equal to T. That means the budget was initially balanced. And if so, government deficit is then equal to increase in government spending, that is G minus T1. That is, budget deficit is G minus T1. If we assume that initially the budget was balanced, government increases its spending, then budget deficit is denoted as G minus T1. So if initially G was 100, T was 100, now 150 minus 100, so budget deficit is 50. Now, with no government deficit, when G was equal to T, equilibrium in the bond market, in the loanable funds market was I0 equal to S0 and the rate of interest was R0. Initially, I0 is equal to S0, where supply of loanable funds was equal to demand for loanable funds. If there is an increase in government spending financed by selling bonds to the public, then total demand for loanable funds become I plus G minus T1, and this is shown as a rightward shift in the demand for loanable fund schedule equal to I plus G minus T1. I plus G minus T1. So, there is a shift in the demand for loanable funds given by I plus G minus T1 and the new equilibrium. Initially the equilibrium was at A, now the equilibrium is at B. The new equilibrium occurs at B, where I write S1 as equal to I1 plus G minus T1. S1 is equal to I1 or I1 plus G minus T1. Now, increase in government spending create increased demand for loanable funds. Increase in government spending creates increased demand for loanable funds as government sells bonds to the public to meet increased spending. So, there is an excess demand for loanable funds over the supply of loanable funds. As a result, the rate of interest increases from R0 to R1. When government increases its spending by selling bonds to the public, what happens is there is an excess demand for loanable fund over supply of funds. Then there is an upward pressure on the interest rate, so that interest rate increases from R0 to R1. And this increase in R has two effects. One is saving increases from S0 to S1. Saving increases from S0 to S1. This is shown by the distance A. Saving increases. When R is equal to R0, saving increases from S0 to S1 is given by the distance A. And increase in saving is equal to decrease in consumption. Saving increases, consumption decreases. So, when interest rate increases, saving increases. Savers will respond by saving more. This is shown by the distance, this distance, and the increase in saving is equal to a decrease in consumption. A second effect is quantity of investment decreases. Quantity of investment decreases with the increase in R. And at R1, the new investment is I1. Investment is I1, and this is shown by the distance B. There is, remember this, an increase in savings or a decrease in consumption, and there is a decrease in investment. Investment is reduced, and the reduction is shown by the distance B. That is, saving increases from S0 to S1. Initially it was savings was equal to this much, S0. Now it is S1. S0 becomes S1. This distance A, decrease in investment is the distance B. Now, as you can see in the figure, the decrease in consumption, which is equal to increase in savings equal to A, plus decline in investment B equal to increase in government spending G minus T1. That is, B plus A is equal to increase in government spending G minus T1. So, government spending increases, but there is a reduction in consumption expenditure, and also there is a reduction in private investment expenditure. So, in the form of a definition, increase in government spending financed by selling bonds to the public pushes up interest rates pushes up interest rates by enough to crowd out an equal amount of private expenditure. Government expenditure financed by selling bonds to the public crowd out an equal amount of private expenditure equal to consumption expenditure plus investment expenditure. Private expenditure decreases because households substitute future consumption for present consumption by saving more, and investment decline because few investment projects will be profitable at higher interest rates. So, this crowding out keeps aggregate demand from increasing when government expenditure increases. So, what happens is aggregate demand is not affected. So, naturally, as long as aggregate demand is not affected, from our earlier discussion, aggregate supply, aggregate demand, as aggregate demand is not affected, price level is also not affected. So, what happens is total aggregate demand is same, components will be different. There is a reduction in private consumption, reduction in private investment, and increase in government expenditure. Only components will change, total will not. So, P is not affected. Now, suppose that government meets increased government spending by printing currency. Now, if the increased spending is financed by printing currency, there will be an increase in the supply of money. And we know that if there is an increase in the supply of money, price level will change proportionally, and aggregate demand schedule will shift along the vertical aggregate supply curve, and there will be a proportional increase in price level. So, an increase in government spending financed by printing currency increases the supply of money, aggregate demand schedule will shift upwards, and price level will increase. Only price level will increase, output, employment, etc. will remain constant at full employment level. So, this is the effect of an increase in government spending. In the next session, we will consider the effect of tax policy, another instrument of fiscal policy.